Hello, everybody. Welcome to the International Macro History Online Seminar. We're very pleased to have today Francois Velde talking about economic activity in San Francisco during the 1918 influenza epidemic. Please know our format is for Francois to speak for 40 minutes. And then to have questions for 20 minutes, and then an informal question session for 15 minutes. If you have like a immediately clarifying question, please put it in the Q&A. Otherwise, please wait until Francois is done. So please take it away and share your interesting thoughts, Francois.
Thank you very much for having me. The usual disclaimer applies. That is, the views I'm going to express don't necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago or the Federal Reserve System. So I'm going to talk about the 1918 pandemic. You may all be sick and tired of hearing about pandemics, but unfortunately, they're not going to go away. And policy questions are going to keep coming up, and it's useful to use the data from history as well as from the present to think about them. One of the things we've talked about during the COVID-19 pandemic is the question of trade-offs. Slowing down transmission has economic cost, and so what's the optimal policy? The terms of the trade-off depend on the endogenous response of agents to the spread of the epidemic, if there is such a response. So the question is, do past pandemics inform us about stable patterns of behavior? We've certainly seen evidence of endogenous response during COVID-19, but it may be interesting to find out if these patterns are more common, more long-lasting. So the 1918 influenza epidemic was the most recent large pandemic before COVID-19, so it's a natural point of comparison for studying the impact of policy interventions. And what's interesting for us is the US offers some cross-sectional variation in terms of the patterns of the epidemic, as well as in terms of the policy responses, the equivalent of modern lockdowns. So the project is to combine data on deaths and mobility. And I'm going to be using mobility as a proxy for economic activity. So it's combining epidemiological data, deaths, and economic data, economic activity as proxied by mobility, and to estimate a structural model of the epidemic with endogenous transmission rates, and the endogeneity of the transmission rates arises from economic choices made by agents. And then once I've estimated the structural model, I can compute counterfactuals and look at trade-offs and compare the laissez-faire policy with the optimal with the actual that was followed. So in this paper, I'm going to be focusing on San Francisco because I happen to have daily data both on deaths and on mobility. So it's very high frequency, and it's going to be a nice testing ground for various functional forms for the structural model. So quick refresher on the epidemic in the US. There was a so-called Herald wave in the spring of 1918 that was barely noticed because although it was a quite virulent flu, it was not particularly lethal. Then it was carried over to Europe by American troops, where it earned the nickname of the Spanish flu, and bounced back to the western side of the Atlantic in late August 1918, arriving in New England and then spreading quite quickly. So the main lethal wave was in September, October, November, in the fall of 1918. Then there was a second or even a third wave in some places until March of 1919, usually less severe. There was another peak of mortality due to that flu in the following winter, which is not studied very much, and I'm going to set it aside. In terms of policies, the so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, were decided at the city and state level because of the federal system in the US. So as we saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, they were essentially measures of social distancing. Almost all cities at some point closed schools, churches, places of entertainment, and shut down large gatherings. There were also occasionally efforts to reduce congestion by having staggered business hours in some places. There were some attempts at testing and tracing, if you want, isolation of infected individuals. That was fairly limited in scope, and I'm going to focus on the closings because those are the ones that will affect economic activity. But keep in mind that none of the so-called lockdowns, and I'll use the phrase, but they were not as stringent as those of 2020 or 2021 by a long shot. In San Francisco itself, the first reports of an epidemic on the East Coast appeared in newspapers in September 12. The first case was reported in September 24, but the Board of Health delayed closings for several weeks. And then when they did, it started in October 18. It was quite typical, as I said before, no need to go through the detailed list, but essentially any non-essential gathering and places of entertainment, schools, churches, meetings, and so forth. There was also a mask mandate, which was unusual at the time. Only a few U.S. cities did that for the period of the first wave. And then there was a second wave in January. There were no closings. The health authorities thought of asking for closings, but none were. There was too much pushback, and so none were mandated, although masks were mandated again for a period of a couple of weeks. All right, so in terms of the data that I have data on ridership on public transportation and data on deaths. So the data on ridership comes from one of the two major transportation companies in San Francisco, the San Francisco Municipal Railway, which still exists, and which at the time represented about a quarter of the total ridership. And total ridership was 500,000 a day for a population of 500,000. So basically the whole population, the equivalent of the whole population rode public transportation, and the Muni gives us a quarter of that. As for the deaths, they're hand collected from Ancestry.com. So I've collected all the deaths that are reported from September to April, and for the same periods in the 5 preceding years. And then I compute daily excess deaths relative to the 1912-1916 period. And this is what the data looks like. So the blue line is the daily excess deaths that I've computed. The red line is inferred infections. If you have a transfer function, which gives you the time from infection to death for those people who die, so it's like a transfer function, you can invert, so to speak, from the deaths to the infections. So this is the red line, which I will use as a check for some data later. And then the yellow vertical stripe is not an NBR recession, it's the period of closings. So you can see, the first wave calms down, and then the second wave, and then it disappears. So that's the pattern. Now for the Muni, this is a map of the Muni at the time. People who are familiar with San Francisco will know that some of these lines still exist. It basically covered all of the city of the time. And this is the source of revenues. For reasons that are unclear to me, the newspapers of the time reported every week the daily receipts of the municipal railway system, and for a period of several years. So I went through and collected the data. This is what the raw data looks like. There's a number of adjustments you can do. This is focusing on the period from September 18 to March of 1919. Again, the yellow stripe is the period of the closings. You can do a 7-day moving average, but that's not a very good idea given the speed at which the epidemic went. You can seasonally adjust and detrend, that's the thick red line, or you can use the ratio of this day to the same day 1 year later. In terms of the results, it doesn't matter very much which of these two I use, and I end up using the seasonally adjusted and detrended. Seasonality is the within week seasonality between weekday and weekends. So the model, the goal is to use these two data series jointly We have data on deaths, we have data on economic activity. We need a model to tie the two together. So the elements of the model are very simple. Agents choose how much to work and to consume, knowing that it exposes them to infection. And so the probability of being infected depends on what's going on with the epidemic. And then the epidemiological model, it's a standard SCIR model but with a transmission rate that is determined by agents' economic activities, by their choices. So it's a so-called compartmental model because the population is divided in compartments. Everybody starts in the susceptible compartment, then they're exposed. Once they've been exposed, they transition to the infected state, and after that to the removed state, which is either recovered or dead. These fractions sum up to 1. The laws of motion are given here. They're fairly relatively straightforward. The lambda t here is the crucial parameter which governs the transmission. So the infected transform susceptibles into exposed at this rate lambda t, which is going to be varying over time. This is the only parameter that's time varying. The other parameters governing the transition in the law of motion and the various laws of motion are going to be constant. So you move from susceptible to exposed. This is the inflow into exposed, the outflow of exposed become the inflow of infected, the outflow of infected end up in the recovery compartment. And then deaths, as I said, there's this transfer function or delay function, which gives the fraction of people who die after S days from the date of being exposed. And so the death is just the integral of this transfer function times the number of people who are infected. And mu, the parameter mu here is the case fatality rate, is for people who have been, the proportion of people once exposed who eventually die. So that's going to be another parameter estimated. So the parameters here, there's the death rate, and then these alpha and mu are going to be calibrated. Now, introducing the economic model into the epidemiological model happens here, which is that the infections result from consumption and work. So it depends on the fraction, the quantity of consumption carried out by the susceptible, as well as by the infected, and also the working activity of the susceptible and of the infected. There's a third component here, potentially, which is infection that happens independently of any economic activity. Now, agents understand that the working or consuming expose them, and the true probability of not being infected is going to be this function here, which is an affine function of the agent's choice n. So I'm going to assume that agent's perceived probability is not necessarily the true probability, but has the same functional form. That is, that it's an affine function of the agent's choice of work, with the two coefficients here, A and B, being functions of the epidemic state. In the true law, probability, that's a 1, but here you can see that the parameter of the epidemic enters through the IT, through the number of infected people. So what's the agent's decision problem? Simply to choose how much to work, how much to work here, how much to consume. I'm going to assume a very simple budget constraint, which makes the choice of work and consumption the same. And then this is a stand-in for the continuation value of for the value of life. So that's the probability of not being exposed to the infection, and that's the continuation value. So the agent chooses N, knowing that it brings utility from allowing you to consume, but it increases your chance of being exposed to the disease. So the first order conditions lead to a fairly simple expression for the choice, the optimal choice of N, which is this function of this alpha term, and alpha in turn is related to BT. BT is the crucial term here. It's how much my probability of dying increases when I increase my my labor or consumption. And then that's the individual, that was the individual choice. Then we can aggregate using the fractions in the various compartments, and we end up with this expression for lambda t, the transmission parameter in the SEIR model. The key thing is that it's a square of the agent's choice of labor. And again, that agent's choice of labor is determined by BT, the perceived probability, marginal probability of infection. So far, I've not specified what that BT is. You could impose, and that's my natural instinct is to impose rational expectations, so that the agent's perceived BT is the true BT. And if you do that, you get very nice, simple closed form solutions with a nice functional form for lambda t, which, as a result of the agent's choices, depends in this simple way only on the current number of infected. And the agent's choice of work also depends on the number of infected. And this kappa parameter here is linked to the value of life, so it even has a nice structural interpretation. So this would really be beautiful. This is a phase diagram that illustrates the dynamics of the problem. So I'm representing things in the space of S, which is the number of susceptible, and I, which is the number of infected. So the epidemic starts at 1, everybody is susceptible, and nobody or just one person is infected. And this thick red line is the standard SEIR model where everything is constant. There's no endogenous response. So the dynamics are that the epidemic grows until you reach this point, which is the herd immunity. Which is the point where the inflow of newly infected is exactly equal to the outflow of infected to recovered. And after that, I dot becomes negative, so I starts decreasing, and then you fall. So this so-called threshold of herd immunity is the point after which, if S is lower than lower than the herd immunity threshold, I dot necessarily has to be negative. And in terms of what you'd really want for an epidemic is you'd want to you start here, somehow control it so that you end up at the herd immunity threshold with the lowest possible number of infected, because then once you've reached here, the epidemic cannot restart. So the best you can do, absent a vaccine, is the herd immunity threshold. The dotted lines are in fact the dynamics with this endogenous response under rational expectations. It doesn't change things terribly. This vertical line becomes this diagonal line here. The dynamics are qualitatively the same, which is that you get one wave. The herd immunity threshold is the same, and then after that the epidemic dies down. But you're not going to get multiple waves just from the endogenous response under rational expectations. So it's a very pretty formula. Kappa has a nice structural interpretation, but is it reasonable? Did agents know the model? Well, the SIR model was published 10 years after the pandemic of 1918, so they didn't have the model. They had previous experiences with pandemics, of course, although the most recent influenza pandemic had been some 30 years before. And most importantly is the question of the information set that they had at the time. So it was back then, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a great hunger for information, and the number of cases reported, number of deaths were published in the newspapers. So you can go to the newspapers and see what information was available. This is the reported cases from two different sources, the red and the blue line. And this line here is the inferred infections that I showed earlier, which is what I can back out of the actual number of deaths. And you can see that the two are not in phase. Reported cases lag with respect to the inferred infections. In fact, they seem to, here I'm showing those reported cases, comparing them with excess deaths and reported deaths, these seem to be much more in line. So if people were following the reported cases as an indicator of infections, they were actually tracking deaths rather than infections. And this is, again, excess deaths and reported deaths. You can see that those are pretty much in line. So the information set was not the right one in any case. And as I'll show you later, the rational expectations form is actually rejected by the data. So we're going to start using ad hoc forms. This functional form here has been used by epidemiologists without any particular foundation, but because it works pretty nicely. So the lambda t, the transmission rate, is a function of this 1/1 plus kappa f of t. F of t is essentially a sufficient statistic for the state of the epidemic, expressed as a function of the current and past deaths, basically like a moving sum of past deaths. You can, this maps into a particular functional form for BT. You could also specify other functional forms. So I play around with different possibilities, but the basic idea is that the agent's perceived probability of being infected, marginal probability of being infected, BT, this T parameter, is some function of current and past deaths. And how much it responds to the current and past deaths, and how many past deaths are, the T here, are how many past deaths are summed up, are going to be the parameters that can be estimated. And finally, there's the lockdowns that I'm going to have to estimate as well. I do know the start date and the end date. That's just from the record. The intensity, its effect on the epidemic, I don't have. And there's also a modeling choice here to be made, how the lockdown affects transmission rate. You can think of it as either a multiplicative effect, as do the epidemiologists, and if it's effectively like modeling it like a tax, or you can think of it as an upper bound on economic activity. You can do so much economic activity, but no more. That would be the effect of a lockdown. So I'm gonna look at these two variants as well. So the estimation, the data is the death series and the activity and the dates of intervention. Two of the parameters in the SCR model are calibrated. And so the parameters that are estimated are the case fatality rate, mu, the R0, the infamous R0, which is how transmissible the disease is initially with a naive population before any endogenous reaction. Kappa and tau are parameters related to the behavioral component, is how much do people react and how many lags of deaths do they observe or do they take into account? And then PC is the strength of the lockdown. So given these parameters, the model mechanically predicts deaths and activity. So I use Monte Carlo Markov chain estimation using a Poisson log likelihood for deaths and Gaussian log likelihood for activity. And then I try to find the parameters that fit the data. So for each value of the parameters, I simulate the epidemic. And I also have to estimate the starting date of the epidemic, has to be solved for as well. So this is a big table, but this is a first run with without using the ridership data, so using only the deaths data. These are the variants of the model, different functional forms. The bottom line is there are some differences, but they don't differ a lot. The big difference is the inf versions of the model, which is when the BT function is a function of current infections, not current deaths. So the inf version of the model nests the rational expectations, and that one really fails in terms of likelihood. The best fit is this one. The case fatality rate is in line with what other people have found. Here's the R0. The kappa, as I described in the paper, it means a sort of medium response, not an extremely strong response. The T is very large. Well, it's 2 to 3 weeks worth of deaths. And then this is the percentage of deaths, reduction in deaths relative to not doing anything. So to setting this coefficient to 0. And you can see that no matter what the model is, the number of deaths in percentage terms is very low. This is using the ridership data. And the key message here is that the results don't change a whole lot. Now, at first sight, that seems a little disappointing. All this work for nothing. I don't think it's disappointing at all, actually. It's telling you that essentially the ridership data confirms the validity of the model. And you get the model that best fits the deaths data also has correct predictions for economic activity, something you did not know beforehand. This is the predicted deaths. So with the best model, the red line is the fitted deaths, and the blue line is the actual deaths. The yellow stripe, as usual, is the closings. And the orange line is the counterfactual of no intervention, so no closings. And the reduction in deaths, as I said, is positive, but not very high, 6%, essentially because the integral under this curve is about the same as the integral under the two waves. So having no lockdowns would have had a single wave, but the total number of deaths would have been pretty much the same as what actually happened when the deaths were spread over two waves. This is the fitted values for the ridership. Again, the lockdowns is the yellow stripe. Here is the imposition of the lockdowns. And then this other line here is what would be the ridership if the lockdown suddenly stopped that day at any point. And so what you see is that in this period here, the lockdown is non-binding, essentially. That is, if the lockdown had been stopped, people would still have avoided using public transportation. And then the two curves coincide here, of course, because there's no lockdown. And here I'm capturing the reaction to the second wave. So the trace of the second wave, which is quite visible in the ridership data, is captured by the model. This is the phase diagram. A sort of phase diagram because with the lags it's a little difficult, but essentially the blue line here is the actual policy that was followed. So the intervention came fairly late. The lockdown started reducing the infections to a very low level. And then the removal of the lockdown provoked the second wave. And then we end up over here. The laissez-faire is the red line, which is you don't do anything. That's the worst you could do. And you end up here, and the two are not very far from each other. The big green line here is the counterfactual where you have all the correct parameter estimates for the model, but you neglect the behavioral response. So you don't know, you assume that people do not adjust their behavior. And so your prediction here would be very alarmist. You would predict a large number of deaths. Yeah. Now, what the Pareto frontier? I can look at the Pareto frontier in terms of reduction in economic activity on the horizontal axis and deaths on the vertical axis. I'm doing this in two forms. What I call constrained is where the only two parameters that the government can choose are the start date and end date, but I fix the intensity of the lockdown to be the actual. So let's assume that there's only one set of measures that they could take. Lockdowns were binary. It's what we observe. The unconstrained is where I also allow the governments to change the intensity of the lockdown and be more or less severe. In terms of qualitatively, of course, one is within the other because they're Pareto frontiers. The key striking thing to me when I drew this picture is the kink, the fact that it's so kinked, which means that the preferences of the policymaker don't really matter very much. This is going to be the optimal point, pretty much no matter what the terms of the trade-off are in the preferences of the policymaker. So starting from the no lockdown, it's very cheap, so to speak, to reduce deaths up until this point. And then if you want to reduce deaths further than that, then it starts becoming expensive in terms of consumption or economic activity. And now I'm going to plot the policy that traces the Pareto frontier, starting at the no lockdown. So we're starting here. This is the number of deaths here on the horizontal axis. And on the left scale is the intensity of the lockdown, and on the right scale in yellow are the start and end dates. So no lockdown, there's no start date, no end date, no nothing. This is the part where we're just climbing on the steep part of the Pareto curve. So we're reducing deaths pretty quickly at very little economic cost. And what you can see is that all it requires is a very short period of lockdown early, but it doesn't last very long, about a week or so. Here, the intensity is going up somewhat, but it still is pretty small. This is the kink. And from now on, if you want to reduce deaths even further, you have to go to a much longer lockdown. That's indicated by this line here of growing intensity. And here are represented the actual intensity. So the lockdown started about the right time, but went on longer and was much stronger than the optimal. And this is the phase diagram that shows you so maximum activity is laissez-faire. So that's the maximum number of deaths. The actual we've seen before is first wave and then second wave. The Pareto optimum is a short lockdown very early on, which is just enough to deflect the curve here, and then basically let it ride and let the endogenous responsive agents take over and do the job of stopping the epidemic. And then the minimum deaths is, which is the best you could do in terms of deaths, is the herd immunity strategy, which is you let the epidemic go until you're very close to the herd immunity threshold, and then you clamp down very hard. You have a very strong lockdown, and that's the best you can do. But again, these are all fairly close to each other. There's some improvement, room for some improvement, but it's really not massive. So they could have done better. The actual policy was well within the frontier. Oh, did I show you that? Yes, here is the actual. I forgot to show that. Sorry. Here's the actual, well within the frontier. But I'm not casting aspersions on them. They didn't have the model. They didn't know what they were doing the best they could. But the key point is this kink, which I find very interesting. But in any event, the gains in terms of deaths would have been positive, but would have been fairly modest. So that's pretty much what I have to say. The ridership data validates the epidemiological model. The behavioral response deviates very markedly from rational expectations. It's somewhat slow, and it takes a number of lags, lots of lags. The lockdown in San Francisco did save some lives, but not many, and it could have been done more efficiently, earlier but shorter intervention, or a longer but weaker intervention. There is some tentative, I didn't talk about it here, but there's some tentative evidence that masks were somewhat effective. And then, further work is to apply the same model, but on cross-sectional data. I also have data on ridership across about 50 cities. Unfortunately, it's not at the daily frequency, it's at the monthly frequency. So I'll be working there and trying to see if I can improve on the functional forms and see how the parameters that I estimate vary across the cities. So that's it.
All right, thank you. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand or indicate that you'd like to speak. I'll start off. I was very curious about, so you're treating this as a single closed population, is that right? And are there people, does the model admit that there are people from outside coming in? And do the lockdowns affect that? And I mean, I know you don't want to complicate two things too much, but a second question would be, there are minority populations in San Francisco that had bad experience with the public health authorities. So I'm thinking of Chinatown and the plague response in the early part of the century. And so is there a way of looking at within the population some kind of differences? I understand that what you're doing is sophisticated and complicated enough, but just sort of what are the dimensions here that might vary?
Yeah, so yeah, of course, I'm treating it as a close population. In fact, there were a number of commuters coming from the East Bay. I don't have daily data on that at all. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. I do
Right.
have monthly data on the commuting,
Do they
and
shut that down?
no, transportation is not shut down. That I've never seen that anywhere. The only cases where I've seen any impact on transportation is when carmen were sick.
Mhm.
But and
Okay,
I've seen that in small towns, but I've
right,
seen no mention of that in San
right,
Francisco. But no, they opened the windows in the streetcars for ventilation, but they kept no, they kept writing. Chinatown, that's an interesting question, and I mean, I have the names of the dead. So, people of Chinese ancestry kind of stand out.
right,
So I could certainly differentiate the impact of the I could, have two time series
right,
of deaths for Chinese and non-Chinese. I could also, there's
right,
other ways I could cut it, male, female. I haven't seen much difference for
right.
that, male, female. And I also have age. So potentially, if I could estimate it, give myself another parameter,
Right,
maybe a different behavioral parameter for some of the subpopulations,
right.
and that's a potential extension.
Now, do I see other questions out there? Okay. Uh,
Yeah,
E,
yes. Francois, I'm also puzzled by the kink in the Pareto frontier. Can you say a bit more about it? Or I wouldn't call it an artifice. Is this just a consequence of the fact that the model that fit better was the one with where the lockdowns were a constraint on economic activity, which of course would mean that once the constraint becomes binding, the the easy part, right? The steep part of the Pareto frontier is replaced.
Well, they become binding immediately. I mean, if they're not binding, then there's no reduction in deaths. So as we're traveling up the Pareto frontier, they've got to be binding. Otherwise, you wouldn't get any effect. So I don't, and I have to check. I think I've computed it. Thing is, I don't have a very good algorithm for computing that Pareto frontier, so it's time intensive. But I think I've computed it with the other variant of the tax variant of the model, and I don't think it made a difference. Anyway, short answer, I don't have a good intuition, and that's a weakness. I need to play around with the model, essentially recompute it for various values of the parameters and see where that comes from and what gives rise to it.
Okay. And the follow-up one, right? Since rational expectations, are a nice benchmark, but hard to defend here. You said that you used a formula that fit, but can you simulate the model such that you would have, for instance, noise about expectations or beliefs, or perhaps something that would confuse agents on whether to go or not? So contradictory messages, whether actually taking the muni would expose them more or less. So what adding a little bit of noise would do to this?
I don't have the answer. Adding noise.
Right, and of course my observation is tainted by the the recent present, right?
Yeah, I mean, if I can share, am I still sharing this? No,
You can.
Yeah,
You're not, but you can share it again.
I just want to go back. Sorry. Yeah, here. If anything, I'm disappointed that the model doesn't predict this sharp decline here in ridership. which starts well before the first lockdowns. And I'm guessing the reason is that the model has to fit the whole time series, and so to fit the rest, it needs some sluggishness, and so the sluggishness is at play here. There aren't many deaths, so people aren't reacting very much. But actually, what got me started in this project is when I plotted this ridership data, and I saw, wow, there was this big decrease even before the lockdowns. So people seem to react pretty sharply. Of course, I could give myself more parameters and estimate time varying parameters or something like that, but that's kind of cheating. So I'm not sure I need to confuse the agents in order to get a better fit, but it's worth thinking about it.
No, I don't want to dominate, but a different way of asking the same question. So in your model, the agents have to decide whether they get out of the house to consume or work, right? And you assume that the only obstacle to that is their expectations, that they get contagiated, or the lockdowns once they're enforced. But how about their employers? Right. So what were the incentives that workers at least were getting from the other side, even outside of the lockdowns?
You mean do I need to incorporate people shutting down their employers shutting down? But if they're shutting down for lack of demand, so apparently, theaters canceled shows even before the lockdowns. That's in the model. That's just people are reducing their consumption. If I wanted another agent who's making different decisions, that would be binding on the agent. Yeah, I mean, the question is, what is this going to help the fit of the model? Yeah, I mean, I can think about it. Think about the employers. I mean, just to be clear, my philosophy is a very lazy one, which is I want to find the simplest model that allows me to jointly exploit the deaths and ridership data. And if there's more wrinkles to the model, I feel I should have more data to bring, to discipline those wrinkles. So the Chinatown example is one case where I could partition the population into groups because I do have the deaths data, and so on that dimension I could estimate different behavioral parameters or environments.
No, fair enough. I guess Paul and I are essentially asking you to make the model more complicated, but
yes.
No, and I mean, I'm not against it necessarily. I just want to, before I do that, do I have the data that's going to help me? Discipline that.
Yeah. Essentially, I was just trying to get whether there would be an easy way of parsing a demand and a supply effect here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Francois, I have a
Hi, Nathan.
Sort of a data question rather than a modeling question. I mean, you might have said this in passing, but I wasn't sure. So what causes the very large fluctuation in the ridership data that you have? Is that just according, I mean, just some kind of a measurement errors? Is that shocks to ridership because of some scares or something that you can exploit this in some way? Noise, I don't know. I mean, because there are some very sharp declines, and that could be maybe related to some scares or warnings, or maybe there's some news items around these dates that could maybe, and you can use a little bit this variation to extract some kind of to add a little bit more to the empirical results.
Yeah, short answer, I don't know. I mean, I've tried as much as possible to investigate these outliers, of course, and look into the newspapers and see, is there anything in the newspaper that day that would explain to me why it dropped off so much or it increased so much. And for outside of this time period, for other periods, I found explanations, but here, no, I don't know. I've removed the within weeks, so there's obviously a big seasonality, which is weekends versus weekdays. I've removed that, which, by the way, is another. Maybe I shouldn't. And again, I could complicate the model, but I exploit this additional dimension of data, distinguishing between the work week and the weekend shopping or consumption. So that's something worth thinking about. But no, unfortunately, I don't know. I don't know what's going on.
And it's not correlated in any way with spikes in death rates, short-term spikes in death rates or any of that. So it's just
No.
it's just noise.
Yeah,
It looks like noise. I mean, from your
it's
perspective,
because it's not persistent at all. I mean, they're really one-day shocks, one way or the other. Yeah. I mean, it's not measurement because the ridership data is recorded correctly, and it also fits with the annual accounts that I found elsewhere and so forth. So it seems to be correct, but yeah, no, there's just a lot of noise in ridership at the time.
Yeah, because some of it seems very extreme, and it could be some, but if you it could be reaction to some kind of panic or some kind of something. What that could be short-lived, but it's I don't know.
What are you intending to do with the ridership data in other cities?
So I'd like to. It's again the path of least resistance. Is estimate the same model or same type of model, but see if the parameters that I'm estimating change over the cities. I mean, preliminary work that I've done suggests that they don't change drastically. Similar parameters fit the data pretty well. The one thing that does change is the R0, and it's kind of a step function over time. That there's a sudden jump and an increase in the R0 somewhere in the middle of the epidemic, which, I mean, that's not economics, that's epidemiology, but I haven't seen anybody mention that. I don't think anybody's ever noticed it. And so that's kind of interesting. But at least, the main thing is to make sure that, external validity, that this is not just San Francisco, and a similar behavioral model works for the other cities. And also,
Right.
I mean, I'd like also to get back to this, the question of what information we can draw from the lockdowns on the effectiveness of policy. I mean, one of the things that I found striking, the fact that the actual policy was well within the frontier. Without a structural model, then if that's the case, without a structural model, it's going to be difficult to interpret observed data on outcome, policy and outcomes. If they're all within the frontier, it's not informing you about the shape of the frontier, about the shape of the trade-offs. So claims that, there's no trade-off, policies reduce deaths and don't hurt economic activity. Well, you don't know.
Okay. Let's see if any of, especially the attendees, want to ask a question. If we're silent, maybe they'll step up. Okay. David Bitch has a question.
Okay. As I recall, there were two different cities, and I can't remember what they were. One might have been Pittsburgh, and sort of they were cited in the early days of our epidemic as having sort of very different responses. And one might have had a lockdown, and then they had sort of much lower rates. And I can't remember what the other city was that had much higher death rates. Do you remember those comparisons? I was just wondering how they would compare with San Francisco, because there are these observations of widely differing responses across U.S. cities according to their lockdown policies or some other policy.
Well, in terms of outcomes, San Francisco was kind of above the median in terms of overall death rates, so somewhat worse than the median. Not as high as Philadelphia. I think Philadelphia was one of the worst. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of oh, this city did that, and therefore that followed, and that shows that there's been a fair amount of that commentary, especially in the early days of COVID-19, because we didn't have a whole lot of information. Again, in the absence of a proper counterfactual, I'm a little hesitant to make claims. At least here in this instance, the model suggests that the gains that could be made were fairly small in any event. And so the big differences across cities may not have that much to do with actual policy.
Okay. Other attendees?
Yeah, but your evidence, just speaking on where you ended, right? So your evidence is very high frequency, but very short, right? And you know that is this ongoing debate, right, on the medium-term effect of the lockdowns and other non-pharmaceutical interventions, right? So how and I feel I'm asking you this question twice, right? Because the first time you were on this webinar, right, with another paper, right? You came to similar conclusions, right? So very little short-term impact. So how would you see the connecting, 2 years after I asked you this question, how do you see the connection between very little short-term and perhaps longer medium-term impacts from public interventions?
Well, okay, so on this paper, there's no intention on my part of trying to show that interventions are useless or anything like that. I'm here, to me, the main focus is the behavioral response, and estimating a behavioral response and showing that it exists, and it alters the terms of the trade-off. But it doesn't mean that policies are useless or shouldn't be attempted. The paper of 2 years ago, I actually feel a little vindicated in the sense that the paper showed that the impact of the epidemic in 1918 with very, very mild and short-lived lockdowns was limited on the economy. And my sense of this pandemic is that the economy bounced back a lot faster than many people. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but at the beginning, people were talking about, is this going to be an L-shaped recession? We're going to be in, stagnation for decades and so forth. And actually, the bounce back was pretty surprising. So, the economic cost to me, it was largely due to the lockdowns. Again, doesn't mean it wasn't worth it, but it wasn't the response of the economy to the epidemic per se. It was more to the policy. So they're just pieces in terms of the trade-offs. Of course, in 100 years ago, the situation was quite different. They had no hope of a vaccine, whereas we obviously did have once. And if you know that you're going to have a vaccine, lockdowns are much more likely to be worth it. The flu, as far as I know, well, that's not true. There's some work that finds long-term impacts of the 1918 epidemic on outcomes. Yeah. Again, there's always the question of what's the proper counterfactual. But anyway, at least at first sight, it's not like long COVID that we have now, which is another big cost that comes from the epidemic.
Okay, let's see one last opportunity for the attendees. Be quiet. All right, let me push the next seminar. If you haven't had enough on pandemics, 2 weeks from now, Louise Boshart and Jeremiah Dittmar are speaking on the pandemic shock and economic divergence, political economy before and after the Black Death. So that should be of interest. And let's thank Francois, for this interesting talk.
Thank you, Francois.
Thank you, Francois.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Yes, and I guess we can end it there. If people want to stay informally, I think that's possible, but thanks for this interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Francois, actually, I was referring to the ongoing debate whether the public health interventions were positive or negative.
Yeah, I try to stay.
I know. Skillfully, went around.
Yeah. So I haven't looked at the latest iteration of their work, but I'll just say again what I said earlier. Suppose interventions are within the frontier, and so the sample that you're looking at is a bunch of dots within the frontier, and they line up, on a diagonal from southwest to northeast, so towards the frontier, and you're looking at this and saying, oh wow, interventions reduce deaths and increase economic activity, so there's no trade-off. No, you're not learning about the trade-off. You're learning, you're looking at a bunch of points within the frontier. You're not learning about the frontier itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking. Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, it's been fun. Thanks for coming back.
Well, thank you very much, guys. Good to see you.
Thank you. And thank you, Paul, for moderating.
Sorry?
Bye.
And thank Paul for moderating as well.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
All right, take care.
Keep well.
Bye.
Keep well. Bye-bye.